All right, this is going to be American History, Unit 1, Lecture 7. This will be the last PowerPoint lecture for Chapter 3. The title of this PowerPoint lecture is going to be The Road to Conflict, Part 1. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War is also called the 7 Years' War. The French and Indian War will set the stage for conflict between Britain and its American colonies. So the French and Indian War, the name is a little misleading because the French and Indian War was really the French versus the British. Now, each side, the French and the British, had their own Native American allies. So you have the British and their Native American allies fighting against the French and some of their Native American allies. So, this will set the stage eventually for the conflict between Great Britain and the colonists. But first, this war actually started in Europe and then kind of bled over into the colonies. Okay, so it originated in Europe. If you study European history, it is called the 7 Years' War. It's that even that name is a little misleading because it actually lasted 9 years. So, talking about this rivalry between Britain and France, it's basically a 500-year-old rivalry where Britain and France have been at odds with each other for obviously a very long time. And the conflict begins in the colonies over this land in the area of what is western Pennsylvania. So, this is actually the area around where Pittsburgh is located. And there is a dispute on territory, on whose territory is whose between the British and the French. But it erupts into an all-out war between France and their Indian allies versus Britain, the colonists, and their Indian and Native American allies. Like I said before on the first slide. So what's the issue? Well, the issue is the colonies want to expand west, and the French and their Native American allies resist that. So if you go back to that first slide there on the first page, it shows that map, and that map shows that kind of dividing line between the red area that was the 13 original British colonies, and then that blue area, which was the French territory. So the course of war: France wins many early battles. The war is fought both in Europe and in North America, like I said before. George Washington was actually a young lieutenant, and he fought with the British for the British during this war. And he actually loses a bunch of early battles or early skirmishes in this French and Indian War. William Pitt was a British politician turned war hero who turns the tide of the war for the British in the colonies. So a lot of the fighting happened in the Northeast. You can see by this map the British forts are in red or triangles. You have the swords that are red. That's where the British won some victorious battles. The red arrows, and lines show kind of troop movements by the British, and then the same thing with the French. The blue triangles are the French forts. The blue arrows and lines are kind of how the French move, and then the blue swords, are where the French won some victories. Now, the darker brown to the right or to the east, that is the area that the British have, okay, or the British possessions, and the lighter area to the left or to the west is what the French, and the disputed area is kind of in between that. And like I've said before, that curvy line follows a geographical formation that I've talked about before, which is the Appalachian Mountain Range. Okay, so those are the Appalachian Mountains, and that's kind of where the dividing line is between the uh, French and the British and kind of the unknown area that is kind of disputed. I know it does say where it says New France. Yeah, that is where a lot of the French, definitely held a lot of territory, and then in between there is is kind of the disputed land. You see Fort Duquesne, Fort Necessity. That's in the Pittsburgh area. Obviously, a lot of the blue triangles are located near major rivers or near major waterways. We have the St. Lawrence Sea River up towards the north. Obviously, both of these countries move troops, move supplies by way of boat. So obviously, a lot of these forts and a lot of the victories or a lot of the fighting occurred close to these waterways. So the war ends. The powerful Iroquois join the side of the British in the colonies. The French city of Quebec is captured. The war actually lasts for 9 years, like I said before, and it includes some fighting in Europe. By 1763, the French are defeated and lose virtually all of their land in North America. So the French previously had land that was as far west as the Mississippi, and obviously in the present day Canada. But now, basically, because of their loss in this war, they get kicked out of North America. So these two maps here kind of show how this progression happens. The purple shaded area is the British American colonies. Okay, on the left-hand side, pre-war. These are the pre-war boundaries. You have the French territory in orange here, and then Spain still controlled Florida, what is now Florida and present-day Texas, in 1754 on the map to the left. And then after the war, okay, the French get kicked out basically of North America. The Spanish will then give Florida to the British American colonies, okay? And then that mountain range that I talked about, if you're looking at the map on the right, it says the Proclamation Line. The Proclamation Line is something that we need to pay attention to. It should be a vocab or will be a vocab, and that is the line that runs down the center of those Appalachian Mountains. And because of what happened with the French and what happened with the Native Americans, the British tell the colonists not to move past that line because they don't want the colonists to infringe or take over any more Native American land. So they tell the colonies and the colonists that they need to stay on the right-hand side or on the eastern side of that proclamation line. And that proclamation line will become an issue here in a little bit because the colonists are going to disobey what Great Britain has to say, and they're going to move past that line because they want to expand westward. So victory leaves the conflict. This is kind of what I was talking about on the last slide. The French and Indian War sets the stage for the conflict between Britain and its American colonies. The main reasons why is the Proclamation Line of 1763. The colonists want to move west of that line. Like I said on the previous slide, they disobey, and the reason Great Britain doesn't want them moving past that line, moving to the west or moving to the left, is because they're tired of fighting with the Native Americans and they just want peace. And lastly, in order to pay for the war, okay, Great Britain has to tax the colonists, okay? All right, and this is where these taxes come in, taxes on tea, and we'll talk a little bit about that stuff next chapter. So no taxation without representation, all of that good stuff we'll get into chapter 4, and this will lead into conflict between the colonies and Great Britain. Just to reiterate, and this kind of gives you a better visual After winning the French in the Indian War, Britain wants peace in the colonies, and they banned colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains, kind of just driving home what I said. And they hope to further avoid conflict with the Native Americans. That's why they kind of set that boundary line. It's just an imaginary line that runs down the Appalachian Mountains. It angers the colonists. The proclamation line of 1763 angers the colonists. They move past the line against the wishes of the British, and the colonists believe that the line shows them that the British don't care about them. So we will talk about taxes. We'll talk more in depth about taxes next chapter. But the British expenses. Britain had spent a lot of money on the French and Indian War. Their national debt had doubled up until this point. Keeping troops in the colonies was expensive. So what did they do to offset all of those expenses? The British began cracking down on smuggling by the colonists. Remember the Navigation Acts? That's kind of what they started cracking down on. They also passed what was called the Sugar Act, and it says that smugglers will be tried by British courts, not colonial courts. And this angered colonists, and they began to protest this. So an act is kind of like a law, but also we'll get into some of those taxes a little bit later on. All right, that wraps it up for the chapter. Lectures, like I said before, if you have any questions, you need to email me.